One of the other elements that's really important to make this very powerful is getting to the root cause, because it's always the root cause that sets up the process, because once we've had an initial experience of something, every subsequent experience just compounds on the previous experience. So getting to the root cause. Now that may not always be easy for you, because you might think, well, I can't remember when this first happened. In fact, Prihi and I worked on that. I was asking her to go back and see if she'd had the pain before. And eventually, she said no initially. And she said, well, yes, I've had it reoccurring for many years. So that's the process of trying to get to the root cause. So again, even if you feel you can't find the root cause, adapt it a bit and say, when was the first time I can remember having this experience? So that's important. But do bear in mind, if we are talking about things that may need medical attention, like headaches, then for heaven's sake it is important to consult your doctor, because we need to be sure that there isn't anything else going on. But when we talk about things like headaches, the thing that I will usually consider very seriously is that person constantly in stress and other issues which I'm going to address later? Are they in constant stress, and are they preparing for the event that they feel they're going to have to produce a lot of adrenaline to cope with, and that event never happens? So of course the adrenaline has to go somewhere, and that can very often be a reason as to why people have reoccurring headaches. So would you like to add to anything there, Dawn?
Only that sometimes when you ask someone where it may have started or where it may have come from, what's interesting is that if they can't think of anything and we say to them, well, just have a guess, it's amazing what comes up with the guess. So often we just have to guess. It opens up the subconscious, and often that's where that information will come through.
Yes, we ask questions like guess, as Dawn's just said, or pretend. Now, of course, people may find it easier to come up with an answer if you're asking them to guess or pretend. But the reality is we're still getting in there. So even if they're guessing or pretending, it's still the same process. And the amount of information that can be gathered from the answer is amazing. Because what we're doing is we're looking at the initial sensitization, which really relates, if you like, to the core issue. It's very often related to the core issue. So it's initial sensitization, the first time you've had that experience, and then the initial sensitization. So going back all the time to the first experience. And again, it's like, let me put it to you this way as to why it's important to tap on those initial sensitizations and those core issues. It's like, can you imagine deciding one day that you want to go and completely change every bit of furniture in your lounge? Well, would you go down to the furniture store and order completely new furniture, but leave the old furniture in the lounge? You wouldn't have room. We have to get rid of the old to make room for the new thinking. Remember that. And again, can I add here, the amount of times that people say to me, oh well, I don't really need to get to the root cause because I've put it at the back of my mind. Well, think about that statement. I've put it to the back of my mind. Well, doesn't that mean that it's still in their mind? They've only put it to the back of their mind. So they think that they don't have to get to the root cause. You do have to get to the root cause to make really powerful and meaningful changes. People say, I don't think about it all the time. It only crops up every so often. But remember that core element here, which is that we are operating from our subconscious 95 to 97% of the time. So we really have to go into the initial sensitization the first time, or maybe even the second time you had that experience, and is it a core issue? And the core issue is something where that is the core of what's causing the problem, not some of the subsequent experiences or the little tales that flow from the initial experience. It's the initial sensitization. So again, let's go back to the spider as a real simple example, is the fact that you think, okay, well, you know, I've only been afraid of spiders since I was 9 or whatever. But again, did you wake up at 9 and see a spider? From that point, what happened? That's not the core issue. You saw a spider and suddenly you were afraid. No. That happened long before. So getting back to the core issues is really important. And a few years ago, I was sitting just on this bench looking out to sea, and I saw this little girl approach me, sweet little girl, and she stood in front of me and she's looking out at the seagulls, and she's fascinated with these seagulls just sitting there, obviously waiting for food. And her parents came up behind her, moved behind me where their car was parked, and they called her to the car. And she didn't come because she's so focused on these birds. And I heard her parents say to her, and I cringed. Her parents said, if you don't come away from there, those birds are going to peck your eyes out. And I'm thinking, should I say something? I chose not to say something. But I just thought, wow, there's a good example of an initial sensitization for that little child who was about that tall. And I thought, how sad. But again, you can't go around interfering with other people's lives when you're not asked. But there is an initial sensitization and a root cause. For this purpose, join them together. Really powerfully beginning to take shape. Dawn, anything you'd like to add?
Well, yeah, I was just thinking, obviously we see many examples of this in our work, but one that just sprung to mind when you were talking, Austin, I was working with a lady who had a real problem with abandonment. Every relationship she went into, she was waiting for them to leave her, and that naturally caused problems. It got in the way of the relationship, and eventually it didn't work out. So it was almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, really. And we did some tapping with her one day, and in this tapping session, as I said, as you're working, going around to different thoughts, whatever you're working on, often a new thought or a new feeling will come up, and a little bit like the demonstration that Austin's already shown, we follow that new thought and that new feeling if it's a very dominant feeling. And in the course of this process, I asked, when do you ever remember feeling, and when have you ever experienced that feeling of being left or abandoned before? And this lady talked about, and this woman is in her late 30s, I'm talking about now, and she said, you know what, it's ridiculous, it can't be that. I said, well, let's go with it anyway. If something's popped into the mind, let's go with it. And she said, I remember when I was about maybe 3 years of age, I was in the kitchen with my mum, and she was preparing supper, and my mum put me on the work surface so that she could chat to me as she was chopping up the vegetables and things. And somebody rang the doorbell, and she went to the doorbell and just left her daughter there thinking, I'll only be a moment. Left her daughter on the side, went to the doorbell, which, as a mum, we've all done these things. But was caught up quite a long time at the door with whatever the scenario was, and it may have only been that her mother was away from the kitchen for 2 or 3 minutes. However, what my client remembered was that being a little girl and calling mummy, mummy, I want to get down, and her mum couldn't hear her, so there was no response, and then feeling, oh my goodness, I'm stuck on here, and my mummy's not coming back. Now, it doesn't matter, because the next thing that she expressed was, well, of course my mum did come back, and of course it was all okay, and of course, blah, blah. She recognised all that, but that's processing it from her reason and logic brain, and that's not where she's stored. The emotion is in the subconscious, and it's held as it felt then. So that 3-year-old feeling, mummy's not coming back, was stored in the body, And she could say, for the next 50, 60 years, I know my mum came back and I know I'm fine and she would never leave me. It doesn't matter. The feeling of abandonment. When we tapped on that thing that she thought was a passing silly thought that was hardly worth mentioning, it was enormous. It brought up so much emotion. She couldn't quite believe it was all happening. And we worked on it, and it was so fantastic. And she really felt afterwards that someone had changed her life. You know, that she felt such a freedom that had collapsed all those other feelings of later relationships around abandonment. So that early one made all the other ones, of the ones that she thought were the problem, you know, boyfriend split up with her 3 years ago and so on and so forth. She thought they were the problems. Then I asked her, often out of curiosity, well, when you think about, you know, X, Y, and Z that happened in more recent years, how do you feel about them now? And she was like, well, they weren't great, but, you know, it happens. It was a completely different response. So that's what popped into my mind when you're talking about when you're able to hit the core issue.
Yes, because, of course, what Dawn could have done in that situation was tap on the relationships.
Yes, yeah.
And she would have perhaps noticed a small change, but it wouldn't have been long-lived, because the core issues are what's firing that behaviour. And think in terms of the core issues as the initial electrical charge in the nervous system. So the experience is an emotional experience for that little girl. She's then has that emotional response, which changes the brain and the body's response. So it's fear. So the nervous system has been triggered. Now that's setting up an electrical charge, and that generates electricity throughout the whole body. So we have to get to the initial sensitization so that we can really address these issues. And yes, of course, Dawn could have chosen to go down the road of addressing the relationships. And sometimes, perhaps, Dawn, I know I do, I'll do that to start just as a softener, because it can be quite an interesting process, and it helps people feel that bit more relaxed as well.
It absolutely, and also sometimes just starting with the area that you're more familiar with just allows us to tune in more into the subconscious.
Yeah.
And then when we ask, okay, is there another time, we're already connecting with that feeling, and it comes more readily.
Yes, it does, because again, to change, we have to change the original electrical charge, as I keep saying, but the subsequent experiences are a different electrical charge. So again, it's getting that initial programming not just into the brain, but equally into the cells of the body. That's what we're changing here.